Picture this. A man is standing in a riverbed 40,000 years ago. He's cold. He's hungry. He's not looking for treasure. He's looking for a rock heavy enough to crack open a bone. And then he sees it. A dull, yellow pebble sitting in the water, catching the light in a way nothing else around him does. He picks it up. He turns it over. He probably tries to eat it. He definitely tries to bite it. And when his teeth leave a mark in the soft metal, something happens in his brain that has never happened to a human being before. He is holding something that will not rot, will not rust, will not disappear. He does not know it yet. But he is holding the beginning of civilization. That is the story nobody tells you. Not the myths, not the treasure maps. The real story of gold does not start with kings. It starts with confusion. Because here is the strange part. Gold is useless. You cannot eat it. You cannot build a shelter from it. You cannot make it sharp enough to hunt with. It is too soft for tools and too heavy to carry far. By every survival metric your ancestors lived by, gold should have been ignored. And yet, something about it refused to be ignored. Why? Anthropologists have spent decades trying to answer that question, and the leading explanation is almost embarrassingly simple. Your brain is wired to notice things that break the pattern of the natural world. Most of nature is dull: brown dirt, gray stone, green leaves fading to brown and gray again. Gold does none of that. It stays bright in the mud. It stays bright in the fire. It stays bright for 10,000 years buried in the ground. To a species that had never seen permanence before, that must have felt like magic. The earliest gold objects ever found by archaeologists come from a burial site in Varna, Bulgaria, dating back roughly 6,500 years. Researchers working the Varna necropolis uncovered thousands of gold ornaments buried with the dead, and what struck them most wasn't the quantity. It was the pattern. The people buried with the most gold were not always the strongest hunters or the most skilled toolmakers. They were, in many cases, buried with symbols of status the community had already decided mattered. In other words, before gold ever became money, it had already become meaning. That is the twist nobody expects. Gold did not create human hierarchy. Human hierarchy was already there, quietly waiting for something shiny enough to represent it. Think about that for a second. Every ranking system your brain participates in today, who has more, who matters more, who gets remembered, some version of that instinct was already running in a Neolithic village before a single coin had ever been minted. For thousands of years after Varna, gold stayed mostly ornamental. Pharaohs in Egypt covered their dead in it, not because they thought the afterlife required currency, but because gold does not tarnish. To an ancient Egyptian, that made it the closest physical substance to eternity itself. Tutankhamun's death mask, carved from over 10 kilograms of solid gold, was never meant to be spent. It was meant to survive. And it did. For over 3,000 years sealed in the dark, untouched, exactly as bright as the day it was made. Now here is where the story turns from meaning into machinery. Around 600 BCE, in the Kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, something happened that quietly rewired the future of the entire species. The Lydians began stamping small lumps of a natural gold and silver alloy called electrum, with an official mark, guaranteeing their weight and purity. Historians consider these the first true coins in human history. And once that idea existed, it could not be undone. Because a stamped coin does something a raw nugget never could. It turns gold, from a symbol, into a system. Suddenly, value wasn't just something you could see. It was something you could trust, without having to know the person handing it to you. A stranger from 100 miles away could hand you a coin, and you did not need to know his name, his tribe, or his intentions. You only needed to trust the stamp. That single shift, trusting a symbol instead of a person, is arguably one of the most important cognitive leaps your species ever made. Economic historians like Neil Ferguson have pointed to coinage as one of the true starting points of large-scale trade because it let human cooperation scale past the size of a village for the first time. From Lydia, the idea spread like fire through dry grass. Persia adopted it. Greece adopted it. Rome built an empire on it. And for the next 2,000 years, gold quietly became the invisible thread tying together nearly every human civilization that came after. But gold's most dangerous chapter was still ahead. In 1492, when European ships began crossing the Atlantic, gold stopped being a symbol of trust and became a justification for conquest. Spanish explorers arriving in the Americas encountered civilizations, the Aztec, the Inca, where gold was still treated the way it had been treated in Varna 6,000 years earlier. As decoration, as spiritual meaning, not primarily as currency. The Spanish did not understand that distinction, or did not care to. Within decades, entire empires were dismantled, and an estimated 180 tons of gold were shipped back to Europe, funding wars, monarchies, and the beginning of a global economy built on extraction. Historian and geographer Jared Diamond has argued that this single imbalance, one civilization treating gold as sacred, another treating it as fuel for expansion, helped tilt the entire direction of world history for the next 500 years. Somewhere in that shift, gold stopped being about wonder. It became about power. And the two would never fully separate again. There is something else worth noticing about that period. The Spanish did not just take gold. They industrialized the taking of it. Mining operations across the Americas, particularly at sites like Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, forced hundreds of thousands of indigenous laborers into brutal working conditions that historians now describe as one of the deadliest labor systems in recorded history. Potosi alone is believed to have produced enough silver and gold to reshape European economies for over a century. A single mountain, mined almost continuously for 200 years, quietly financed the wars, palaces, and empires of an entire continent it had never seen. Meanwhile, that flood of American gold and silver arriving in Europe caused something economists still study today. Prices across the continent rose dramatically over the following century, an event now known as the price revolution. When you suddenly introduce enormous amounts of a scarce resource into an economy, the value of everything else shifts around it. Your ancestors were learning, the hard way, that gold was never just an object. It was a force capable of reshaping the price of bread in a village its owners would never visit. By the 1800s, gold had a new kind of story, not empires, individuals. In 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall found flecks of gold in a riverbed while building a sawmill in California. Within a year, over 300,000 people had rushed toward that single discovery. Entire cities were built in months. Entire families gambled everything they had on a rumor, and most of them lost. Historians estimate that only a small fraction of gold rush miners actually made a lasting fortune. Most of the real wealth was made by the merchants selling shovels, not the men swinging them. That pattern, a rush toward promised riches, driven more by hope than evidence, has repeated itself again and again throughout history, long after gold stopped being the object of desire. Similar rushes followed in Australia, in South Africa, in the Yukon. Each one told the same story with different scenery. A discovery, a wave of hope, a handful of winners, a much larger number of people who left with less than they arrived with. Psychologists studying decision-making under uncertainty, including work built on the research of Daniel Kahneman, have pointed to this exact pattern as a window into how the human brain handles rare, high-reward possibilities. You do not weigh a lottery-sized payoff rationally. You weigh it emotionally. The story of striking gold is simply one of the oldest emotional stories your species has ever told itself. And notice something curious hiding underneath all of it. Every gold rush in history happened after people already had reliable ways to survive. Farming, trade, steady work. Gold rushes were never about survival. They were about status, about the dream of stepping outside the ordinary life you were handed. That is not a story about metal. That is a story about you, and about the part of your brain that still lights up at the idea of a shortcut to significance. And yet, through all of it, something remains constant. Central banks today still hold gold reserves worth hundreds of billions of dollars, not because gold generates interest or produces anything, but for the exact same psychological reason your Stone Age ancestor picked that pebble out of the riverbed. It does not decay. It does not disappear. In a world where currencies rise and fall and companies collapse overnight, gold is one of the only things human beings have ever agreed, across every culture and every era, is permanent. So here's the question worth sitting with. Why does a species that has walked on the moon, split the atom, and mapped its own genetic code still treat a soft yellow metal as one of the most valuable substances on Earth? Consider this. Gold has no biological use to your body. It cannot nourish you. It cannot heal you. And yet, economists estimate that nearly all of the gold ever mined in human history, roughly 200,000 tons, still exists today, melted down and reshaped again and again across thousands of years but never destroyed. Somewhere in the ring on a stranger's hand, or the bar sitting in a vault, there may be atoms that were once worn by a Roman senator, or buried beside an Egyptian king, or pulled from a Californian riverbed by a man who lost everything else he owned trying to find it. Nothing else humans have ever valued has that kind of unbroken thread running through it. Maybe because gold was never really about the metal at all. Maybe it was always about permanence, about finding something in a world of decay that refuses to decay with it. Your ancestor standing in that riverbed 40,000 years ago wasn't just holding a rock. He was holding the first proof he had ever seen that something could last. And somewhere in your own life, without even noticing it, you are still chasing exactly that. Not the gold, the permanence. The thing that stays bright long after everything around it fades.